There's a saying that will be the theme of this talk. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. That's from poet Dinos Christianopoulos back in the 1970s, after he was shamed and shunned by the Greek literary community for being gay. I think being a seed is a good thing. A seed can never know how much sunlight and water it will receive, or who it will nourish in the future, or when. It just knows how to persist. Near the end of this talk, I'll give you a list of things that you can do right away to be the seeds and to support democracy and strengthen our local community, but also to take care of yourselves. We all know by now that the goal with the mass, indiscriminate firings of government employees without due process is not reform or cost savings. It's aimed at the incapacitation of vital government functions in order to grab power for the wealthy and stun the rest of us into immobility. Not to mention the fact that many of the typical signs of domestic, mental, and emotional abuse that you would see clinically are present and being endorsed politically at a national scale. When the President of the United States calls people like us who don't agree with him his enemies, that's pretty scary stuff. So think about it. Any domestic household with this much abuse in it would be a candidate for social services and therapy. By naming it, we get to put it in a jar with a label, mental and emotional abuse, and it gives us room to step back from the daily shocks and gather our wits and maybe tell others what this really is. There's a lot more about this in a fact sheet that I'll give you later. There's a fact sheet that is on the web, and for those who can see, I'm getting a phone. Must be some war plans. Anyway, things you can do. Go to Jeffco, if you can't see this, which you can't if you're on Zoom, unfortunately. Go to jeffcodemocrats.com, and then go to events, and then go down to today's event, March 2025, and then scroll down beneath the Zoom link, and you will see the fact sheet, which has all this supporting material on it. It has an article called Recognizing and Countering Abusive Leadership that I wrote. It has local and regional organizations by category that you can investigate. And the categories include speaking out, voting with your wallet, political and individual action, climate resilience and sustainability, land conservation, immigrant rights, charitable giving, housing, food security, health and wellness, and special events, almost all of them local. So, and they have links within the PDF document. There's also a section on staying informed and a sample letter to your representatives. The other thing I wanted to bring up was, boy, do I wish I'd had this book, and it's called Rules for Whistleblowers, A Handbook for Doing What's Right by Stephen Martin Cohn, Esquire. It's a nationally acclaimed book, and it's literally the Bible on whistleblowing. So if you have people that you know who are in a situation where they're seeing problems and they don't know what to do, this book, it has a red cover, white writing with a black stripe through the middle. I'm describing it for the Zoom folks. It's an excellent, excellent book. So we all have decisions to make. And should I resist? And if so, how? How much personal risk am I willing to take? For me personally, I think about what my dad, a World War II combat veteran, went through for 3 years in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy through 3 amphibious invasions, 1 capture and escape, and many ground battles. I think about him, and I'm sure many of you have family members who've put their lives on the line, or maybe you have. I've always figured that if my dad could serve the country like that, I can try to honor his memory, and I bet many of you feel the same way. Also, whenever I get tired, I think about Ukraine. So here's my story. For 3 years, until mid-2006, when I left the federal service, I whistle-blew anonymously to the New York Times about the corruption I was witnessing in Alaska under the George W. Bush administration. Why do people keep calling me? Sorry, Pete, I'm not answering. Basically, I was witnessing a lot of corruption, and George W. Bush's, President Bush's Secretary of the Interior at the time was Gail Norton. So my experiences, though not as severe as what's happening right now, might provide some context for understanding the political pressures that are on federal employees who are by law required to be non-political. Greed is always what drives corruption and fraud, and whistleblowers on the inside are how everyone on the outside finds out about 90% of it. So to illustrate how complicated the decision to whistleblow was, I had a whispered hallway conversation one day with a friend of mine who was the head of another division, and this person quietly said, "Every day that I come to work, I feel like either a victim or an accomplice." And this was shortly after I had just made my decision to whistleblow, which took me a while to make this decision. And I said to this person, "You don't have to be either." And we both agreed that we should stop right then admitting any more to each other. This was so that we could maintain plausible deniability in case we ever had to testify under oath. I told no one about my whistleblowing. I told no one that whenever my boss told me to destroy a document, I took it home. Complete anonymity was my protection. It was also very lonely. Back in 2003, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, as oil companies insisted we call it, was the top story in the news. I was the only Fish and Wildlife Service person in the country, other than our director in Washington, D.C., who was authorized to speak to the press about it. This was at the start of a huge coordinated effort between oil companies, Republicans in Congress, and political appointees in the executive branch to overcome public opinion, science, policy, and even the law in order to drill for oil in the crown jewel of conservation lands, not so much for the oil, but for the purpose of crushing environmentalism in order to cement climate change denial into public policy. Back then, it wasn't so much own the libs as it was own the greenies. The hatred for environmental causes that get in the way of petroleum profit goes back a long way. In 1959, scientist Edward Teller told a meeting of the American Petroleum Institute that carbon dioxide from burning oil would melt ice caps and raise sea levels. So 43 years later, in 2003, Republicans and oil companies were well organized and ready for a fight. That's doubly true today with Project 2025 and the daily flush of executive orders. It's always a good idea to look at things both historically and cumulatively. Patterns you recognize can make it a little less surprising. In other words, as the 18th century writer Goethe once said, anyone who doesn't draw from 3,000 years of history is destined to live hand to mouth. So in 2003, some pretty outrageous things were being said. You had ExxonMobil taking out full-page ads saying 150 countries who agreed on the science of climate change were in a green conspiracy. You had Google holding fundraisers for Senator James Inhofe, who was the loudest climate denier in Congress. You had white supremacist groups petitioning us to put white males on the endangered species list. And we were required to treat those petitions seriously, except on our lunch hours. Even Jimmy Hoffa's son said on behalf of the Teamsters that it would be tyranny if they couldn't drill the refuge. This was the last 5% of the American Arctic coastline that was not open to oil drilling. At the same time, the head of a so-called science committee of political appointees, most of whom were not scientists, told a room full of us biologists that climate change would be beneficial in the North because it would bring more vitamin D to communities in the Arctic. The explicit purpose of that committee was to find fraud in scientific research. Does that sound familiar? If you worked in the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska back then, it was an upside-down world, as it is for the whole country today. So to me, today's craziness isn't completely new, but the size and danger of it is. Are there any civil servant retirees or present in this room? Thank you for your service. These folks, their quiet, steady dedication, they never get enough credit for it. And the same goes with if there are any on Zoom, raise your hand so you can see each other, because you guys deserve a lot of credit. So I want to make it clear that the decision to whistleblow was very difficult because I loved the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I really loved all of the biologists who worked there. We were a real team. So there are different ways to do this. You can go public by going to the Office of Special Counsel and officially claim protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act, while the inspectors general investigate your claim. But good luck with that, because the minute it's public, you become radioactive. And also back then, there were enough loopholes in the law to make it that you were going to blow up your life anyway. So if you didn't want to go public, you could send an anonymous packet of material to the Inspector General, and they might investigate if you supplied enough evidence. But now with Trump and the Inspector General's gone, that avenue seems closed. Another way to do it is leaking to the press, which is a form of whistleblowing that if you get caught, there's no legal protection from retaliation. But since reporters had been jailed, back in 2003, I had seen a reporter that had been jailed for 85 days for refusing to reveal his source. So I was pretty nervous about going directly to a reporter. So there's a fourth way to do it, and this is what I did, and that was to use an intermediary. So no tracks would lead directly to me. So here's why I started whistleblowing. The clampdown on communications in 2003 began when a biologist at Arctic Refuge talked to the New York Times about the caribou he was an expert on. He made valid points, and it infuriated politicians in Washington, D.C., which caused Alaska's Congressman Don Young to repeatedly and publicly attack this GS-12 biologist by name. So I received a call shortly after that from Young's committee staffer in Washington, D.C., and he demanded that I prove everything that biologist had said. So we used to have this thing we called malicious obedience. You basically load all these reports into a truck and send them, and well, sure, they're going to read them. But he also threatened me by saying, you better keep your people in line. So the call was illegal. Capitol Hill is not supposed to be calling staff biologists and making political demands. The purpose of a law called the Hatch Act is to maintain a federal workforce that's free from partisan political influence or coercion. So having a committee staffer call me, a civil servant, on behalf of a United States congressman and threaten me if I didn't comply with political demands was illegal. Eventually, I learned from a reporter that my name was apparently on Congressman Young's hit list, which was widely publicized in the news. But I didn't file a complaint because when you pit an investigation team from the Inspector General's office against a chronically unhinged congressman in a Republican administration that's bound to get all the oil it can out of national wildlife refuges, you can probably guess who's going to lose. So the whole thing was really intimidating. I didn't know what being on the hit list meant, but I would find out. Soon after that, I was called into the office of my boss, the new regional director, He was a career civil servant who had recently replaced the old regional director, a man everyone except oil companies really respected. The new boss told me these exact words, and I know because I wrote them down immediately afterward in a thing called a memo to the file, which I recommend if you're ever in a dicey ethical situation. First, he said, "I'm a political appointee." And I reminded him, "No, you're not." But he said, "Everything's political now, so I may as well act like one." When I said, "That's prohibited," he said, "Nobody cares." He was right. Then he gave me an illegal order. His exact words were, "Congressman Young told this to the secretary. She told this to the director. He told me, and now I'm telling you. Visits to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge by Republicans are to be considered a priority, and visits by Democrats are to be discouraged due to lack of staff time." Unquote. End quote. Remember, this was in 2003, during a time when Republican Don Young would yell at Democrats on the House floor that if they hadn't actually been there to the refuge, they should sit down and shut up. So I asked my boss, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Very much so. The congressman wants everyone to see the refuge." So of course I said, "Everyone, both parties?" And he said, "I haven't heard as much interest from the other side." Well, I wasn't about to break the law and say, "Sorry, we're closed to Democrats," to anyone from Congress who called and wanted a tour of the refuge. So when I got a call from Democratic Congressman Ed Markey's chief of staff about getting one of our planes for a refuge tour, I made the arrangements. My boss saw them in a weekly report and canceled them. Then he came into my office and said to me, "I don't know how the congressman from Massachusetts is going to get up there to see the refuge, but it won't be our pilots flying him or our biologists guiding him." So I asked him, "Are you telling me we can take out members of one political party but not the other? That would be illegal." I wanted clarity on his order to violate the Hatch Act. He said, "No, I'm not saying that." I said, "Then what are you saying?" And he said, "I've got a meeting. I'll see you later." And he left. So I gave Markey's office the phone number for the Arctic Refuge manager in Fairbanks, who had not been so ordered, and he made the flight arrangements. But my boss got wind of them and canceled them too. So eventually I would have a fairly open communications line with Congressman, now Senator, Ed Markey's office via occasional packets of snail mail that I would send from home. The purpose, of course, was to alert Congress of the corruption in Alaska. But from my vantage point, it was also about being heard. It gets really lonely when you're whistleblowing anonymously and you can't talk to anyone about it. Today, I can only imagine what it must feel like to hear the head of personnel for the entire federal government say he wants to put all federal employees in trauma. So just imagine hearing that. So being coerced to violate the Hatch Act was why I started whistleblowing to the New York Times. Before I started this, there were things that led up to this decision. So they included, we were told to post only ugly photos of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on our website, and also to provide only ugly photos of it for a congressional briefing. This made for a real kerfuffle that I had to answer for in the Washington Post. It was ridiculous, but denying that the department had ordered us to post only ugly photos was another chip out of the rock of my personal integrity. I mean, think about it, as if being ugly was enough justification to drill it. For several months that year, the secretary and her minions were literally on an aesthetic jihad, saying we need to drill it because it's ugly, literally. So we were also ordered to remove important biological information from the website. At that time, the polar bear was the poster child for climate change, and the scientific reports that were justifying getting it protected under the Endangered Species Act were being suppressed, including a report to Congress. Anytime a photo of a polar bear was published by a news agency, I would get a call from the Department of the Interior demanding to know if we had given it to them. Once I was even ordered to do a retraction in a publication that wasn't even ours. And I had to supply proof that I had done the retraction. A lot of scientific reports by biologists underwent language changes that weakened their conclusions. When my boss changed the language in one legally required report so that oil companies could drill in a protected area just outside the Arctic refuge, he refused to let us see the altered report. So his secretary quietly left a printout for me under a pile of papers on her desk. This too is resistance. I passed it to my contact, along with the news that the Fish and Wildlife Service's then director in DC, who was compliant with oil interests, had an op-ed coming out in USA Today, urging the public to let drilling begin despite legal hurdles the administration hadn't yet leaped. I was ordered to edit a draft of that op-ed, but I refused because I couldn't make its lies ring true. And I tried. But to refuse too many times was dangerous. So on the day that op-ed came out, an opposing one was published right alongside it. Although elections are already being targeted as we speak, here's another Hatch Act violation that'll give you an idea of what you're likely to see. Well, no, you won't see this. This is what will happen inside government as midterms approach. The 3 communications officers for the Fish and Wildlife Service, that was me, National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska, and we were all good friends, were twice ordered to set up and attend press conferences for Senate candidate Lisa Murkowski, one of which was 2 weeks before the election. This was a blatant violation of the Hatch Act, despite the fact that Secretary Gail Norton's staff told us, "Don't worry, the secretary herself will be there, so that's your cover." We all 3 knew that this was illegal, but my boss insisted that not only I, but also my staff attend too, or I would face discipline. It was like the administration was trying to ensnare as many of us as possible in the oobleck. But if you lie or break the law for someone, it's a form of self-treachery that makes it easier for them to coerce you the next time. My boss got angry when I said I didn't want to go, and he threatened me with insubordination. So I showed him an opinion from my legislative liaison, a lawyer I'd hired from the U.S. Attorney's Office. It said attending this event would be a political act, and therefore, she knew it was illegal, but she said it is a gray area in her memo. So it could also endanger her license to practice law. So I told my boss, leave my staff out of it. I'll go if you want a hostage. So he agreed. We weren't all that friendly by this point. At the event, a photographer for the Department of the Interior made sure to take photos of every federal employee who was there. So now we get to the part about your job as members of the public. When I was under tremendous pressure from the Office of Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Craig Manson, to basically gut the Arctic Refuge's webpage and replace it with oil adoration, I dragged my feet. First, I asked for guidance. None came. Then I explained to a political appointee that everything on that website was backed up with scientific research, and I offered to send him that proof. But the Department of the Interior in those days equated our hard science with naked partisan advocacy. So I had to find another way to push back gently and politely. My pushbacks were always polite. It is a known fact that no administration that's taking a hostile action against popular policy likes being dragged through the muck by an outraged public. That's where you come in. We were ordered to scale back the Arctic Refuge webpage and to eliminate anything about impacts from oil drilling. When I told them that the public was watching the page, and they were, and that they would not react well to that, they said, "Then bury it so deep no one will ever find it." Other than that, there was still no guidance. I called DC to try and get clarity on what they wanted, but the flack in charge, and I call him a flack, who'd gotten his job because he was a friend of the Dick Cheney family, wouldn't even tell me who gave the order. And I wasn't at a level where I could just call the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. I also did not want to call his deputy, a woman named Julie McDonald, who was known for screaming and swearing at civil servants, and who managed to illegally overturn 7 major endangered species decisions before she was finally investigated, which had forced her to resign. But that was years away, and so I wasn't going to call her either. So with no one to call, we forged ahead on our own, incrementally diminishing an offline test version of the website. Each time, the flack in DC would say, not far enough. So finally, we launched a severely redacted Plato's Cave of a website, and it gave people who were waiting for something like that their smoking gun. In a word, the crowds went wild. In those days, you always returned reporter phone calls. It was very bad form to have did not return calls, and especially no comment in any news article. It guaranteed instant blowback, both from the press and from your own agency. That's another thing that's changed over the last few years. I had one of the most hostile interviews ever with a reporter who accused me of manipulating the science. Since I was the spokesperson, I was expected to fall on the sword and cleverly dodge the questions, never admitting what everyone knew the Department of the Interior was up to. Had I told the truth, the retaliation would have been instantaneous. When this reporter cross-examined me like a trial lawyer and asked if I was being ordered by the department to eviscerate the website, I had to say no, we were just being extra cautious. So I took the blame, and I got crucified in national and international media as variously a shill, a liar, a naive fool, or a nitwit caught in the crossfire. Most of them called me a nitwit. But it doesn't feel good. But it did raise an outcry, a public outcry, that I was able to use when the department again asked me to remove more material from the website. I pushed back and was somehow allowed to, maybe because I had taken some heat on their behalf. So I said what we actually needed to do was to put some material back. Because of that public outcry, I was able to say, I almost shouted it into the phone, we are practically under siege here. This is the first big smoking gun, and it's about Arctic refuge, the biggest issue on everybody's radar. There are at least 1,200 links on other websites linking back to our pages. Breaking those links is going to be consequential. Are you ready to let it keep building this media momentum? The idea of breaking all those links and calling attention to the missing material was too much, and they folded. We even got to put back some of the old information, and it stayed there for years. The point of this story is that the noise you make provides cover for civil servants who are trying to push back on unethical reversals of long-standing policy. In this case, it was a website. Today, it's much more aggressive, but Congress still talks to agency heads when they come under pressure. The noise you make needs to be much louder, but regardless, it lets civil servants point to you, the noisemakers, and to ask political appointees, are you willing to face this outcry and to see it get even louder? Even the Trump administration has backed down on some major things after the public really let them have it. So you, as members of the public, and some lone civil servant toiling away at some obscure desk may not have the full picture of what's going on behind the scenes. But a good reporter can often put the puzzle pieces together. You may not agree on everything that the news media does, but the good ones advocate for open government. While they too can get distracted by the flooding of the zone, they are a vital part of our democracy. And surveys show that in areas where local newspapers no longer exist, fewer people vote. So in one example, I'm going to share with you, one more example, about how powerful this whistleblower public reactivity ecosystem is. My boss came into my office one day when Anwar fever was at its highest pitch in Congress. Remember, the Arctic refuge was really a proxy war over who controlled public lands, which was a proxy war over who controls the climate and the future and who gets to speak. My boss was chuckling about a new map that he'd seen of the Arctic refuge that was going to be trotted out at a hearing on the Senate floor in a few days. I didn't know it at the time, but the purpose of the hearing was to open the refuge to drilling via some trickery because they couldn't do it legally. So unbeknownst to the rest of us, they redrew the map of the refuge boundaries and secretly scooped in native lands to help justify how much money they'd make drilling for oil. There was an obscure old law from, I think, the 1800s that they were going to use to drill and get royalties on native lands regardless of the owner's objections. So I said to my boss, "What new map? What about the old map? The original one from 1960. That's the official one." He said they weren't going to use it. They liked the new one better. I didn't know what this new map meant, but quietly passed the tip to my contact outside the agency, who gave it to the New York Times. That reporter put two and two together and went to our headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, and asked to see the original map in its locked storeroom. To everyone's shock, they found an empty folder. It had been stolen. Now, I knew the head of Realty in Washington, D.C., and he and his staff were genuinely shocked. So someone else had gotten in there and stolen the original map. It has never been recovered. This hit the front page of the New York Times. The hearing was canceled. Republican senators flew into apoplectic rages. Drilling language was struck from all the other bills, budget bills. A witch hunt was initiated for the leaker, and I was terrified. But the public went ballistic too. And that's what bought a few more years for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That reporter's work so infuriated the Department of the Interior that I got a call from a staffer demanding a detailed account of her behavior, saying the assistant secretary is going to go after her. He's going to demand to the editorial board that she be fired. I want any dirt you can give me. Well, I had none because we had never talked, because I went through an intermediary. I got in touch with that reporter this week for the first time in 20 years or more, and she might be on the call. So if she is, I'm still not going to identify her, but hello if you're on the call. I'm so pleased to be back in touch. So what the public can't afford to do is to tune out all the news, even though some of it, yeah, for your psychological survival, because no one person can absorb all of this. You have to pick your battles and urge others to pick theirs too, but also to take care of yourself and themselves. Maybe just follow one or two major issues and get some expertise on them. That way you can be very specific and issue focused in your calls and letters to elected officials, and not just the ones in your district either. I'm talking about all those silent Republicans and Democrats nationwide. Ask them specific questions and demand answers. They may never answer because you're not in their district, but that's not the point. The point is to flood them with your demands to defend the Constitution. You'll find all of their contact information on that fact sheet that I've provided with links, along with a sample letter. So share your letters with friends, and so they can adapt them for their own purposes. So we should flood the zone back. So I'll end with this anecdote. The Department of the Interior eventually started looking for a way to get rid of me via an intimidation scheme. But in those pre-Musk days, civil servants still had strong protections, and you couldn't fire anyone without just cause. You still can't, but Trump's illegal acts have stoked a 5-alarm fire, a government fire. Although lawsuits are slowly working their way through the courts, the judiciary system, we can't depend on them alone to save us. The trigger for this intimidation campaign was twofold. Remember, I was already on Congressman Young's hit list, and I wasn't the compliant, obedient shill for oil drilling that the department wanted. So they needed to find a way to get rid of me. Around that same time, there was a big scandal in Alaska, and I broke my personal rule of never getting publicly involved in anything outside my job. I wrote a letter to the editor of the Anchorage Daily News, but as a private citizen. You don't identify that you work for the government when you write a letter to the editor or anything like that. I was just too angry not to write. I expressed my disappointment about illegal profiteering by Alaska's Secretary of State, who was about to be indicted until Governor Murkowski pardoned him proactively. My letter questioned the use of honorifics for officials who would abuse their elected offices. I suggested that instead, the honorable should apply to firefighters, nurses, members of the armed services, etc. It must have stung somebody, because my staff got an inquiry the next day from Congressman Don Young's office asking if I still worked there. Whoops. 3 weeks later, a demand came from some unidentified source in DC for me to get a top secret security clearance. I already had a high clearance called critical sensitive, and I didn't understand why I needed a higher one. They gave me a 127-page form called an SF-86, or Questionnaire for National Security Positions. It required me to go all the way back to childhood. I filled it out, but contacting people that I hadn't talked to in 30 years was a little awkward when I asked them if they'd mind being interviewed about me by someone from the Defense Counterintelligence Agency. Also, they told me the investigation would cost $40,000 and it would come out of my budget, which would hurt. I didn't even know where the dams were in the state, let alone what classified material looked like or how to treat it. So this made no sense. Therefore, I needed some answers before turning in my paperwork. When I asked my boss if he or his deputy had this clearance, he just laughed and he said, "I'm glad I'm not you." He said that a lot. Neither of them had a top secret clearance. I told them I wouldn't know classified information if I fell over it, and asked them, "Why should I have a higher clearance than you?" But they shrugged. I called DC and I asked who had top secret clearances, but nobody did. And nobody was willing to help me. I called my counterparts in other regions, and none of them were being required to get it either. Nor were any of my colleagues in Alaska. It turned out that in an agency of 9,000, I was the only employee other than some law enforcement special agents who were being required to get a top secret clearance for a wildlife agency, go figure. Basically, somebody was cutting me from the herd by trying to get 127 pages of juicy details about my life so that they could either shut me up or fail me for the clearance. Failure, for reasons that I would probably never know, would trigger a transfer out, obviously so they could install a sycophant. My personnel officer told me that if you do have a top secret clearance, you can also be summarily fired and the usual investigations can't proceed because the information you were supposedly fired about is classified. So, this was starting to make sense in a cockeyed way. After months of trying to convince myself that this couldn't possibly be happening to a career federal employee in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I had to conclude that someone was targeting me and that others knew about it. And boy, was that a lonely feeling. Meanwhile, for 3 months during this time, my home phone, which was a landline, would crackle like someone was picking up an extension every time I used it. And twice, I'm not kidding about this, there were black sedans that pulled up in front of my house and started taking pictures with telephoto lenses. Once while I was sitting on my porch, and once while I sat in my living room with the door open and visible out to the road. It was creepy. It was really creepy. I learned later that if they really wanted to wiretap my phone, it could be done without making noise. Mm-hmm. So when I saw the black sedans each time, I got up to go ask them what they were doing, but then they pulled away. So I was pretty rattled. But I told no one about it because, except for one of my staffers. In fact, this is the first time I've ever talked about it. So my staffer agreed that it could have been some sort of scare tactic meant to either send a chill through the ranks if I talked about it or to make me look hysterical. So I said nothing, and I started to push back a little bit and argue with my personnel officer, who told me again and again, "There's blood on the floor over this clearance. You must turn in your paperwork." But for nearly a year, I refused, saying that until I could get answers, I would hold on to it. The weird home stuff stopped after about 3 months, but the office stuff continued. So by then, I had a significant heart arrhythmia, and I was scared, really scared. So like any good bureaucrat, I wrote a memo. Addressed to my personnel officer, it reminded him that this memo was subject to FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act requests. I wanted to alert anyone who read it that I would be publicly fighting dismissal. Then I presented all the evidence to show how it appeared that I was being targeted. I concluded by saying, this must be a mistake. And I handed in the memo. Amazingly, it worked. The department never contacted me, and several weeks later, I learned secondhand that they weren't going to pursue it. But they revoked my critical sensitive security clearance, so I now had something that maybe a second grader would get. I didn't care, and in fact, I laughed, because A, I was going to leave, but I hadn't told them yet, and B, my clearance hadn't mattered before when it really should have. To explain that, 5 years prior, on September 11, 2001, I was actually physically inside one of the 2 secure complexes where cabinet secretaries were brought for continuity of operations, which had never been invoked before. I was at a meeting of government communications officials, or professionals, and I had loads of contacts on my government-issued cell phone, plus a written address book, etc. But every single one of us who could have helped was kicked out, which crippled their communications ability. So now, 5 years past that, revoking my security clearance could mean they could withhold any information from me that they deemed sensitive, thus making it impossible for me to do my job and therefore fireable. Trump has recently done this on a much bigger scale via executive orders, including against civilians in law firms that defended Hillary Clinton and Jack Smith. On my last day at work, my personnel officer told me that the orders for this top secret clearance had come from outside normal channels. He was very cloak and dagger about the whole thing. Turns out it came from Vice President Dick Cheney's office. Apparently, from news articles I read later, abuse of security clearances for people in key positions that they wanted to boot out was a tactic used by Cheney's lawyer, who was known for his aggressiveness in promoting other things like waterboarding. This man later replaced Scooter Libby as Cheney's chief of staff. Scooter Libby, as you may recall, was convicted and sentenced for obstruction of justice, but he was pardoned by Donald Trump. The point of all this is, it's not like we haven't seen criminal behavior before. Nixon comes to mind. No administration is perfect, but abuses like what we're seeing now are extraordinary. They require extraordinary resistance. We can't assume, like James Carville said, that this administration is going to implode so we can all just sit back and relax. We are one Supreme Court challenge away from a full-blown constitutional crisis. Too many leaders remain silent. Some Democrats have disappointed us, and they just elected a DNC chair who on February 8th called working-class constituents the little fella. Don't let anyone infantilize us or take away our power. But others are leading by example, and we know who they are. We have some seriously gifted politicians in the Democratic Party and elsewhere who need to be allowed to step up and lead before it's too late. Outside the party are plenty of others who are equally horrified. Don't ignore or keep blaming those who voted third party. The time for that has passed. Mend fences. Reach out to people who aren't like you, and don't throw away the chance for finding common ground. History has shown us over and over that only broad coalitions that were willing to make compromises for a common goal could defeat fascism. But the other part of this equation is the leadership and direction that must come from we, the people, ourselves. Just as I was able to point to the mighty noise the public was making, our elected officials need to be able to do the same. They're begging us for help. The media may be the fourth estate, but they're not immune to grabbing at the shiniest, loudest new piece of outrage porn that Trump tosses out. Headlines have been trashing us for months as weak and disorganized. Outrage porn is what keeps us all back-footed, and it's how Trump floods the zone. Take it back. Except for totalitarian regimes, the rest of the world is also back-footed by the daily shocks. But they're watching us to see what we do. Ordinary Americans. So, do we have tools? Yes, of course we do. We have organized noise, we have legal action, civil action, targeted communications, community actions that strengthen local ties. insisting that our elected officials do more. These are how we fight back and become more resilient. There's a large list with links to local organizations on the Jefferson County website, and on this fact sheet as well. All these groups are focused on strengthening community ties and on multiple acts of preserving our democracy. So I'm talking about Indivisible and Local 2020, Climate Resilience Planning, Housing Solutions Network, Fuse Washington, many more. There are a dozen pages in this fact sheet. You can just investigate and join the ones that match your own knowledges, skills, and energies. But it's important that we all try to do what we can. And that includes filling Congress's mailboxes and jamming their phone lines, because we want them to complain about all the noise we're making. So I'll finish with this. Back in 2003, I went to the media instead of the Office of Special Counsel because I saw the Secretary of the Interior ignore an Inspector General's report on her own deputy, who was later convicted and jailed. I was too scared to be outed as a whistleblower because of guaranteed reprisals, so I stayed anonymous and on the job. It worked, and I think leaking, especially now, is a far more common form of whistleblowing. Plus, now that 18 inspectors general have been fired from the executive branch, and all the senior JAGs have been fired from the military, the watchdogs who would investigate illegal orders are gone. That leaves federal employees on the inside to hold the line, and all of us out here to echo, amplify, and help them. Truth is the courage of your own mind, and it is a form of freedom. Jefferson County's voter turnout in the last election was 87%, the highest in the state. What if we could match that in our community support and resistance? What if we could all be seeds? Thank you.